Welcome to Mediation Playbook, the podcast that provides winning negotiation strategies. Join us as we explore the world of holistic negotiation from experts across business and industry. Our guests will share with us their insights and draw on their experiences to provide you the techniques and tools you need to become a master negotiator. Now let's get started. Welcome to Mediation Playbook, and on our episode today is my guest Nancy Sherman, who is a professor at Georgetown. And Nancy, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and some of your current work?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much, David. Looking forward to the conversation. I'm a philosopher, and I specialize in ancient philosophy, but also moral philosophy, ethics. My most recent book is pictured in the back there, Stoic Wisdom, ancient lessons for modern resilience. And I came by this through backdoor, you might say, not my own training. I was involved with the military for 30 years, brought in as an ethics chair, the first distinguished ethics chair at the Naval Academy, in the wake of a cheating scandal, massive cheating scandal. Anyway, they were an implicitly Stoic culture. Military culture is Stoic culture with a little s, suck it up and truck on, is how they always would put it. Or even less eloquently, embrace the suck, which I thought could be rather unhealthy because I also, for all sorts of reasons, but I have a background also in clinical psychology. I don't practice therapy, but I've been trained in psychoanalysis. So I thought, given what I know about the military, this is a recipe for disaster. So it led me to, as I was teaching and I realized Stoicism was their thing, it led me to return to the Stoics and think hard about healthier Stoicism, the blessings and curses of Stoicism. That was one book years ago. Two other books came in the middle of that in the wake of our 20-year war, the forever wars, you might say, Iraq, Afghanistan, because I was following individuals about moral injury, of the moral dimensions of psychological trauma. And then Stoicism again came up because I was on a lot of shows, podcasts and the like, where my hosts or fellow panelists really still thought about Stoicism as grit, vulnerability, invincibility. And all the red flags came up again for me.
Right.
And I thought, I got to go back and really look at the Stoics, start reading them all again and see if that's really their only story, or that's maybe one strand and one that's overemphasized. Not just the military, but the tech bros really found this is the new Zen. The real new Zen.
Certainly had a renaissance from a marketing perspective anyway.
Yeah, Jack Dorsey on Twitter, he took ice baths and said it was a way to be Stoic. There was actually a funny line about that. He said, I walk to work without a coat somewhere in Silicon Valley. And he was telling this and I take ice baths. And he was telling this to a Canadian broadcaster who said, that's very fine, sir, but try a Canadian winter. Rather funny. That's how it came to be. And I think there's a lot of richness in their practical guidance. They call themselves doctors of the soul, therapists of the passions, that sort of thing. Those are really the terms they use. And there is a lot of practical guidance, but sometimes it gets stripped of what's, to my mind, really critical. And that is that resilience, we know, really requires social supports. It requires a strong system that helped keep you honest as well as open and enjoying other people and the discourse that comes from it. And that got minimized. So I kept looking in Stoicism. Is it really all about me and retreat to the inside? And I thought, no, that is Epictetus at times. He's a very popular one of the Stoics, himself enslaved and finding virtue and happiness in the inner sanctum, because that's where real freedom is. But he was also playing to the crowds. He was a lecturer, newfound freedom, 18 to 22-year-olds. I teach them, you got to keep some of the jokes coming. And he had some of those. You want
Right.
your nose is running, wipe your own nose. You don't need other people to wipe it for you, that kind of thing.
Right.
But Seneca is really a quite wonderful person and writer, famed man of letters, minister of Nero, and someone who struggled with the idea of retreat to the inside, but he worked in a palace. He was advising a dictator, an emperor, and
Surrounded by people, but friends nowhere.
Exactly. Right. And trying to curb his own interest in the palatial glories, wanting an ascetic life of a sort. So he gives you the push and pull of our lives a little better. My real love in all this is Aristotle. He is the staggering genius of not just the ancient world, but of philosophy. He was a polymath. It's hard to imagine the breadth of his curiosity and his explorations. And he really thought, he said, we're social animals, famous quote, we're social political creatures. And self-sufficiency is not for someone living alone, but for people with spouses, wives, would be the way he put it, friends, fellow citizens, and the like. And spend your days together, spend time together. There's nothing about this retreat to inside. He had virtue as the dominant good of a good life and all the virtues, but always with a really, really important place for friends, relationships. Critical. It structured the good life. So I'm working on a book on how to have a soul, what Aristotle can teach us about enduring happiness. And that just takes me back to early work I did as a graduate student and undergraduate.
And when is that book coming out, or you have a time set yet for that?
Probably spring. Where are we now? 2026.
Okay.
That's what we're hoping for.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
We'll have to have you back then. But I'll tell you, when we first spoke, I am a fan of your work in Stoic wisdom. For me, I had read some of the Stoics years ago, been a fan of them, was intrigued as they have gone through this renaissance, really over, I'd say, as much as the last 10 years, but hadn't had a chance to really return to the original works. And I found your book, and forgive me, I don't remember exactly how, but I'm glad I did. It's a real pleasure to have something that's contemporary on Stoicism and yet not caught up in, as you put it, the tech bro culture, the self-obsession of characterization of Stoicism. I found it very enlightening. So highly recommend to our listeners to check it out. There's also an audiobook version, which I find makes things easier for me myself. But yeah.
Great. And in paper, if print is the thing.
For those, right, exactly. For those who actually still read. How silly, right?
I am surrounded by books. I can't break the habit.
I think you have the universal size, the stack on the floor. When you get to the point when you have more, then I have a habit of I'll pick up books wherever and buy them, and then they end up in a stack. I have a stack on my nightstand, but that every so often I'll have to take the bottom and put that down to the stack on the floor. And at some point, one day, I'm going to retire and actually be able to get through all of these books that I've been accumulating over the years, because I can't read them fast enough. Yeah.
It's always, and there's a double version of this, or doubles once you get to my department office.
So you have two stacks that you're working through. Got it. Okay, one at home, one at the office.
They're all over the place, and I'm a print. I have to say, I am a print person. Everything gets marked up with stickers and underscoring. I can't track fast enough.
That's the one thing I don't enjoy about the audio. I love the convenience of the audiobook, but you're right. There's no way to highlight or mark up, and it's difficult to take a quote and to find that quote and to come back to it. I think maybe there is an audiobook app out there that can do this, where you can somehow tag it. Yes, exactly.
I think you can sync Audible and Kindle so that you.
Yeah.
or you're
You know what? I'll have to investigate that, look in a little more, because that would be a game changer for me if I could be able to mark them up. Digitally is fine. I don't mind the digital. I just mind there's no way to mark it up that I've found with the audiobook, because you'll hear a line or read something, and you're like, oh, I want to come back to that. I want to reference that again, but it's gone. Right. Anyway, we didn't come here to talk about audiobook tech. We're on here today to talk about negotiation, and in particular, I thought it'd be very interesting. So thank you for coming on, Nancy. I appreciate your time, because I thought it'd be very interesting for us to talk about famous negotiations of Stoics and of Aristotle, of really from classic literature. And so one place I wanted to start, if we could talk about, you mentioned Seneca, and Seneca, who is famously a tutor of Nero, and his negotiation or his effort to negotiate his retirement from public life. And while we don't have the blow-by-blow history from the newspapers of the day, we do know some of this, and we know obviously it did not end well for Seneca, famously. But I'd love to get your thoughts a little bit about that and what that can teach us about negotiations, and perhaps less high stakes negotiations than those that require suicide at the end.
Sure. So you're right. We don't know a lot about the conspiracy, the Pisonian conspiracy that chased him out of town or raised suspicions for him. But in his older life, he's in retirement from political engagement in the court. And the standard move in those times was, I wouldn't say an invitation to commit suicide, but forced suicide or enforced suicide. You do it, but you're required to do it. And it's hard to know all the emotions that run through Seneca's head as this is happening or he's being forced. And this is very common. Seneca was in exile early in life in the island of Corsica, sent there by Claudius, and because of allegations of a adulterous affair he was having, I think, with the niece of Claudius. At any rate, it led to 7 years. I know Corsica. My daughter lived there for 3 years. It's gorgeous now. It wasn't then. Yeah, it wasn't then. It was desolate. It was hard to thrive. And he wrote lots of letters to his mother at the time, and not to worry. He knew isolation and forced retreat. In the early days, he was actually brought out or brought back upon the pleading of Nero's mother, married at the time, to Agrippina, to Claudius, to bring him back, as he was the most gifted speechwriter and man of eloquence. And she wanted to teach her young prince son a few things about that. And that's how he got out of that. So he's no stranger to politics and the like. And he has this sensibility. Stoicism was the philosophy of the day. It was practiced. You would be taught it by tutors in homes. Boys would be, at least. And so he's always struggling with what's in your control and what isn't in your control. And so I think he understood that forced exile, forced retreat is not in your control. What is in your control is what you do with it. And in the case of the last one, it led to lots of letters, these famed letters to Lucilius, a junior civil servant, you might say, that are more literary form and the epistolary style. I don't think they were ever sent. We don't think they were ever sent. There's tons of talk about, I can't wait till you receive this, and I receive your return letter. That's how they all greetings to you. That's how they begin. But I think these are really to his alter ego.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that piece of it.
We don't have evidence of ones that came back. Or I think the speculation and evidence at the moment seems to be, that's my understanding from historians. So, but it gives you a sense of someone finding meaning in his predicament. Yeah. He doesn't really talk about suicide. He talks rather about things like, I was so surprised to learn how much I grieved for my young friend Cernus who died. I should have prepared for that. Why or how? Well, you premeditate death. That's one of the Stoic practices. You don't let it blindside you. Think about it a bit so that you know that you're mortal and it could happen. And so he says that regarding a younger friend. He said, I didn't think that someone younger than myself would predecease me. I should have been aware of that or not been caught off guard. And I suspect also what he thinks about is he faces his own mortality. I don't want to be caught off guard. But he's no stranger to the horrors of Nero. Nero kills his half-brother, he kills his mother. Seneca is the speechwriter that tries to paper it over for the public.
Right.
He's a shady guy in many ways, a hypocrite in some ways, but a man of letters, where he exposes the struggle. You don't always get the full candid account, but you get it. You get an account of a guy who is attached to palatial glories. There's no doubt about it. He's a vintner. He has a large vineyard. He's got tons of money in Gaul and probably Britain at that time. He's hoarding it away. But he's telling you, I like mattresses where you don't see the indentation of your body on the mattress. It should be like straw.
Yeah.
That thing.
Well, it's interesting because obviously, I think it seems to me obvious that's what drove a lot of his work in and around anger control, right? And how to prepare yourself for such situations, because obviously he was working, his final client. That was so important, right? That was really the work, right? As a man of letters, covering the up for, maybe covering up's a bit strong, but no, I'm really trying to figure out how to help his client manage that and also create this public persona of that there wasn't, that he's not a madman at the helm.
Yes, right. Whether or not he played the fiddle on the roofs while burned.
Whether figuratively or literally.
Exactly. Nero was supposed to be a good musician. Yeah, he was. I think the anger stuff was also his own. He's dealing with a horrible, very problematic boss, client, as you say, that gives him fancy title and all that, but one who is young, petulant, lots of questionable affairs, and incredibly anxious about power and the loss of it on Nero. And hence he gets rid of his half-brother who might take over the throne or something like that. So
propose a challenge.
Yeah, it's a challenge. And the anger part is for him, but I think for everyone, including himself, that anger is an impulse that can come on very quickly. And he says in the essay on anger, De Ira, that it catches you by surprise. And it's a plague, he says. It devastates cities. It leads to wars. It's a runaway emotion. And if you think maybe Aristotle does, or the Homeric tradition, that it whets the appetite for war and that's how you go into battle. No, you should act on principle as opposed to anger. And so he has these thoughts that overlap or depend upon the philosophy of the emotions, that they're actually cognitions, thoughts, not just blind pushes and pulls, and that they are also actions, like chosen actions. We don't think of emotions that way, but that was the ancient Stoic view, that they're voluntary actions, chosen actions, and that they are, a cognitive behavioral therapy almost. They're really made up of thoughts. And you may get the first impulse that you've been offended, that there's been an injury to yourself, but you can press a pause button, you might say, put space between the impulse that comes in from that fresh impression and how you respond, and also how you form that full set of beliefs. Are you going to go for revenge in the jugular, or will you think about a more mediated, calm response? And so he actually calls those first impulses that may have a less control proto emotions. They're like not the full thing. The full thing you need to give a set you need to assent to. These just strike you, but you don't have to, and they might strike you and leave you a bit unnerved, but you don't have to act on them or indulge them, we might say.
And
so
that's, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No,
I was going to say, that's where the planning comes in.
Yeah, that's the Stoic method of trying to find calm by having, as you say, thought about it in advance so that you have a strategy for what to do. Now, you don't want to leave yourself without armor. Bear shows up in your midst. You want to have quick fight, freeze kind of responses. And maybe those are what those proto-emotions are. You know what to do. Our survival depends upon quick emotional response. But many of them are indulged, he thinks. And even fear could leave you powerless without you're so frightened that you don't know how to act. This is what military training is about. You're supposed to have gone through this so many times and that you can engage in more deliberate ways as you need to, not just with revenge or rage.
But then you're prepared to act in the correct fashion. That's the appropriate response, whether that's military action or in terms of our day-to-day interactions.
Absolutely. Family life, somehow feeling like you've been disrespected or shamed or something like that. And so the negative emotions are the hardest ones to control, but also he thinks some desires, sticky, acquisitive desires, that where you really want something and you won't let go. And so it leads to anxiousness, anxiety regarding, I got to have it, or something of that sort of obsessive desire, compulsive desire, we might say. And so it's both the panicky aversion or quick anger, boiling blood, that kind of thing, as well as I want it this way, where you don't leave much room for negotiation, mediation, change of plan, openness to other voices.
So it's a way of preparing yourself for the limitations that may be required through mediation or negotiation, whether it's of your own personal desires or again, bringing it back to our main topic here, if you're in a negotiation situation, by planning ahead, the lesson here is you can be prepared for any of the permutations that may come about.
Exactly. You might not have full armor, but you've got more agility than you would if you were stuck in one frame of mind.
That's right. No, that's a great way to put it, rather than necessarily coming into a negotiation with this is my position, take it or leave it. I'm a tough guy, tough gal, hard-nosed. It's being prepared for what are the various ways this could play out and knowing what to do so that you don't react. You don't let that immediate proto-emotion take over for you and then put you in a worse position.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a way of finding a steady state.
Yeah.
Acting from some calm. I wouldn't say the worry is that you get over controlled by stuff. It's always stiff upper lip, to be British here, but I think the phrase is actually origin. I discovered American. It's not affectless or passionless or rooting all that stuff out. Or being so controlled that there's nothing natural. It's more that the emotions that would really get you into trouble because you overstep or let down your guard a bit too much if you're in a negotiating position, or want too much and I want it only this way and I won't tolerate any deviation. The thought is to be able to pivot a bit more quickly, especially as the information changes. So they're very big on, the way I've put it in the book is there may be a changing landscape. We philosophers would say an epistemic landscape. How it's all coming in is really different, and the information flow is different. There's some real differences out there, and you've got to be able to adjust your expectations to be able to respond to a changing scene, and that's very much a part of the Stoic mentality.
Right, and I think that's very, very appropriate for when we're discussing negotiation situation where the circumstances shift on you, and what your goal may have been at the start may not be the goal at the end. So you're working on a book on Aristotle. So let's talk a little bit about Aristotle then. And what were his thoughts about how to quell such emotions? Where did he write on this, and how did he put that into practice from what we know?
So he never views himself as a kind of therapist or a doctor of the soul. That's a term that comes later with the Hellenist philosophers who follow him. But they're all in the same tradition, clearly, that the good life is a life of inner virtue. But he is not as worried as the Stoics are about the slings and arrows of fortune, that they could catch you off guard or undo everything, and that you got to really put a bit of a fortress around yourself in order to, or at least make yourself so ultimately flexible that you can handle it. He's thinking that we are vulnerable. He accepts vulnerability. He doesn't fight it. It's a relief that he does that. Yeah. He knows we're fragile, that our goodness is fragile, and that also our control is somewhat fragile. That said, he's always thinking about good character and ways in which the phrase he uses is the judgment rests in perception, or something to that, discrimination rests in perception. He's interested in the particulars, that you can really see the nuance of the situation, that your sensitivities, emotional and intellectual, in terms practical reason, are really attuned so that you, like a good judge, you can see how things change, and you can pick up through sensitivities that are both intellectual, cognitive, you might say, as well as affective, the way your emotions are educated. You can see what's needed to be done. So it's and you hit the mean, the famous phrase, you hit the mean. Now that's not like a middle point. You always have a scale and you're always just in the middle. If you are a hothead, then you're going to lean a little bit more toward controlling the hotheadedness. If you're a wimp, then you're going to beef up a bit and toughen up a little bit and go into the negotiation, for example, knowing where your proclivities are, what your tendencies are, so that you're not blinded by them. But if we think of Stoics as always interested in calm, you were Zen, finding even the Western Zen master, that's not Aristotle. Aristotle thinks you could be really angry, and that could be apt. Imagine now, say, indignation at subordination or something like that. That wouldn't be his choice. Anger could be hitting the mean because it expresses that you've been unfairly treated, and your choice may not be revenge. You may have a whole array of choices, but it could be that you're registering it and feeling it, and like the Stoics, deciding what to do. But he allows for a much wider palette of emotions, and the whole range, everything you feel. This is the guy that wrote about the Poetics, about tragedy, fear and pity that you see on stage. Look what happened to Oedipus. He was blinded, maybe by the gods or by his own ego, however you read that play. And look what he did. He married Jocasta, his wife, and he got blinded, and horrible things happened. So what do we see? And he's a person almost on a pantheon, Oedipus, right? Yeah. Oedipus wrecked a king. But often tragedies about people who are not so good, but good enough that we like watching them and identify, and they're but for fortune. The pity and the fear is you're actually trembling watching. So he doesn't try to dampen or tamp down the emotions that are part of full living. And that's what's so remarkable about him. That's one side. And he also insists in 2 out of the 10 books, for example, in the Nicomachean Ethics, one of his major ethics works, that the way we structure a good life is friendship. And friendship of other good people who we learn about ourselves from. They act as a mirror. We can see ourselves better through them than we can see through our own mirror, through our own eyes, because they're willing to tell us of our faults. And he will say, we're not like cattle grazing on the pasture. We share in thought and discourse, or we feel joys with other people. He celebrates a shared life. It's so refreshing. Students that read Aristotle's Ethics, when they come to those books, I think, oh my gosh, this is a guy who really knew about social bonding. And he did. It's very exciting. And it gives you a sense, that we're in an epidemic of loneliness, says the American Surgeon General, that has deleterious health effects like smoking cigarettes. It's a risk. There's real data for that. There's deaths of despair. We know kids are feeling isolated, probably exacerbated through social media addictions of sorts. And Aristotle's sort of your face-to-face, in-person friendship and the value of it. And do what you can. Do what you can to hold on to good friends, but not just good friends who are also good. Not all our friends are ones that we choose to live with or have as significant friends in our lives. But he says we go drinking with some, we parlor games, we would say, with some, all of that. Casual friendships, collegial friendships, workplace, utility, advantage, pleasure. But friends of character, that's a different story. And you can't have too many of them, because otherwise your friendships will be watery. Literally, that's the phrase. Critical. You never hear, that's not the kind of story you'd get out of the Stoics. They're not the glories of friendship. If anything, they're telling you, your friend died. I know it's sad, but move on. Figure out how to move on.
No, that's interesting. That strikes a particular chord. Maybe it's just because I'm the parent of teenagers right now, but in terms of thinking about that, the value of those friendships, and as those friendships form and break apart, and the what good values there are from them, and where they can be problematic, which I think is more an issue in your younger years. But that's interesting.
And he actually takes that up. He said, if friends are, you want to hold on to friends and keep them. And you might have thought they were good, but maybe they were frauds. Or maybe you were naive about who you chose. He goes through both of those. And then it's your response. Then you were at fault, he says. But he says it's not bad to give up friends if you can't reform them. That's a word we might not like, but they really can't change in ways that are productive both to the friendship and good in its own right. And he says there's nothing wrong with breaking those friendships up. So he gets the tension. You worry, am I not giving it enough of a shake? Who was to blame in forming this bond? I shouldn't have gotten into it. I'm a parent too. The heartaches that your kids go through. And if you live with others, all the issues of, I didn't know about that. When did that happen? Surprises in relationships. Some are more stable than others. And he knows about that. And he thinks if your character is good, stability of good character is more stable because there's a sense of the value. But of course we lose friends. Death, not just changes of heart and soul, which is what we were talking about. But there could be illness and death. And he thinks you can still reconnect with others. And so he really thinks about a life where you're living it with others. Now, what his own example was it's a sort of a personal detail we don't know a ton about. He wasn't going to. Women have very inferior roles in that world. Marries someone very young, has 2 kids, one through a wife and one through a companion later. But he worked with people all the time. He was the other side. I'm talking about his ethics, but he's a scientist. He was our first scientist. He discovered science. He discovered marine biology. He was on the shores of Lesbos in Greece, and in an inner lake now called sort of Aristotle's lagoon. He collected mollusks and octopus, we would say, cephalopods. Those were his favorite But he dissected them. He drew pictures of them. He collaborated with local fishermen to see all the species and the taxonomy and the like. So he worked with people all the time.
In a variety of capacities. Yeah.
Yeah. As practicing scientist, as a teacher in the museum, which was an old ancient gymnasium in Athens. The grounds are still there. I've walked them. And he's called the peripatetic philosopher. He walked as he taught. A lot of us pace when we lecture. He was pacing and with followers and he was communing with his students in relationships with students who were the note keepers of the lectures. Those lectures presumably were
interesting. Okay.
Maybe he wrote drafts initially, but it was good. Always get yourself good students who can take good notes.
Interesting. Let me ask one question I like to ask folks come on to the podcast here is, what's one commonly held belief in your field? And so let's say about Stoicism, that's something that you passionately disagree with. That's a common belief out there.
One I would definitely say is this idea of bulletproof invincibility. You see this coming up in various tech bro talk, that you gotta protect yourself from the ugliness out there, whatever it is, bosses, ordinates. Sometimes it gets horribly misogynistic, and that is as awful as it comes. If you go down some rabbit holes, which I went down while I was writing Stoic Wisdom, the misogynistic language is horrible. And it's a lot like, tough it up, don't give anything here, scumbags, etc. And that actually is the idea of the misogyny is not part of Stoicism, ancient Stoicism. It's, of course, we're in the ancient world and there's lots of stuff that we would find politically alien, horrific. But on the other hand, someone who's, for example, Epictetus's contemporary and teacher, Musonius Rufus, not a household name, but anyway, he says, women can come to my lectures because they have the same reason and hence ability for excellence, character excellence that men have. And that's a very important reminder that he's opening his lectures to everyone. This isn't just a macho philosophy or a philosophy that excludes women. So that's one of my beefs.
It's interesting because, like I said, that's what I feel like in pop culture, that's what Stoicism has come to mean, that ideal of this toughness and the, as you said earlier, building the wall around you rather than necessarily, no, bad things happen and how you deal with them is where the toughness is. But if you have a wall around you, the bad things can't happen to you, and you're actually not prepared for when someone breaks through the wall, some bad thing does happen. It seems like it's almost turned on its head in practical application. Right.
Yeah, you crack as opposed to bend. And the best read on Stoicism is agility to change. They have these rehearsal methods. We talked a little bit about preparing for the future, they call it pre-rehearsing. But there's also the idea of, horrible term, but mental reservation, that you stick Seneca puts it, that you stick a unless before your plan. He says, I'll go out for a boat ride unless it rains. I'll get office. I'll be elected to office unless the other candidate comes in first. I often think Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse, a favorite book, and it always begins, it's in the Hebrides, Outer Hebrides. It's very rainy in northern Scotland. I've lived in Scotland. And she says, the mother, who I think was probably Virginia Woolf's mother, the basis of the character, James, we'll go out to the lighthouse if it doesn't rain. It's like a repeated thing in the beginning. And that's a Stoic idea. Prepare for the possibility that the other thing might happen. And that's a sort of, it's more flexibility than rigidness of vicissitudes that could fall. That said, they're not really big on the full range of disaster that could happen right? You get a little glimpse of it. Seneca at one point says in a letter to young Lucilius that Lugdunum, I believe it was in the ancient world, Lyon has this devastating fire that kind of rivals the great fire of Rome. And he said, even our shared friend, whoever, I can't remember who it is, mutual friend, what was shocked by it, and it left everything in ruin. And he himself, Seneca, is shocked by it. So that's a glimmer of a disaster that could happen where it would be hard to be prepared for, at least to suggest. But that's not the company line. It's that you typically can be prepared and should. Aristotle doesn't think, he wants stability of character, but he doesn't think it will always get you happiness. You could be in such war and pestilence. Your children could turn out to be horrible, not good. He says in other sorts of things, illness, you could be horribly ugly. We don't like to think about that part. My students go, "Ooh, really?" He says that. But there are things external that affect your happiness. And all of that may not be in your control could put a dent in it. There have to be a lot of them to really put a big dent if you're a really good person. But look at what we're in: famines, we're in wars, we're worried about climate. There's horrific climate change. You're outside LA, you see it. The globe, the marine, the waters are heating up. Fish are shrinking. Aristotle would have been horrified by that. The fish he studied, half the size they are, he wouldn't know what to do with that. But it would be a subject of interest to him and probably would not turn his back on it. He's a scientist. He says in the beginning of the Metaphysics, we all desire to know, and we get pleasure from our senses, the discrimination that the senses allow.
Interesting. Yeah, no, this has been some really thought-provoking stuff, Nancy. I appreciate it in terms of. So tell us, if folks want to find out more about you. Obviously, we've talked about your book, Stoic Wisdom. You mentioned you're working on you have a forthcoming book on Aristotle, How to Have a Soul, right? Is that the working title?
Working title.
And I know you're heading to Wales shortly for a festival. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
That's right.
Yeah.
Sure. This week, at the end of the week, our Memorial Day, their bank holiday, it's called. There's a very big festival on the border of England and Wales, just on the River Wye, W-Y-E. And it's in Hay, a huge literary ideas and music festival with, 4,000 folks or so. And there are various events, intense and stages. And this large event is called How the Light Gets In. I believe that's what it's called. And How the Light Gets In. And it bills itself as the world's biggest music ideas festival. And I'm giving a talk on the book, Stoic Wisdom, an interview about the book, I suspect like this. And then 3 debates. One is with Peter Singer, a philosopher known for his stand on animal rights and environmental issues, and a practical ethicist. He was involved with the effective altruism movement for a while. And another guy named Slovak Zizek, a Slovenian British man. And that one is about climate, or the gods. Do we have to rethink ethics so it's not human-centered, but larger than that, given how we devastated our home and environment. A second one is about these issues. Optimizing the self is the story of the self-improvement industry and what it means, both in terms of the beauty market, you might say. And there's a British columnist who anti-beauty product person, another person who writes about self-improvement and 60s trips and all that stuff, and myself thinking about Stoicism. And a third one is called Something for Nothing. Don Marielli, who's a behavioral economist, talks a lot about reward structures, and Paul Bloom, who's a psychologist, a child psychologist, among others, who's at Yale, and myself, who thinks about virtue and virtue's rewards. We'll be talking about those topics. So those should be fun. They eventually will make their way onto record. They'll be recorded, so whatever the medium is that gets it all out will be in place. We'll all be mic'd and recorded, so eventually they'll put them out. So that will be a very rich set of days, busy.
Yeah, it does. It sounds like a bit of an aggressive schedule, but it does sound interesting. We will put links for all of that into the show notes so that folks can check that out. And if they're listening after the festival, can check out the recordings, but also check out the books. And also your website, it's nancysherman.com, correct?
That's correct. And I don't yet have all the links for what will eventually be social media friendly for this festival because it hasn't yet happened. I will once it's done.
We'll get it together. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any final thoughts before we wrap up here?
I don't think so. I just think bear in mind that Aristotle is the giant of the ancient world of staggering genius, and from the celestial skies to the lowest creatures in the waters, and then us somewhere there, and
somewhere in between.
Yeah, and he's very approachable. I've fallen in love with him since I was an undergraduate, and so he's always in the background of my thinking about Stoicism. Are they really saying that? What would Aristotle say about that?
Well, looking forward to the book when it comes out. And in the meantime, thank you again, Nancy, for your time and coming on the podcast here. And thank you to our listeners. Appreciate that you're taking the time. And as always, if you have any questions, we'll have the links in the show notes so you can follow up with our guest or otherwise. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it so much. Thank you, David. Really, that was fun.
Thanks for tuning in. If you found our show valuable, please subscribe to our YouTube channel for exclusive video content. We love hearing our listeners' thoughts and suggestions on guests or topics for future episodes, so please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or comment on Spotify, and we will catch you on the next one.